Something cracked in Australia, and the people closest to the Sussex operation are not sure it can be put back together. It was not a press conference. It was not a formal statement. It was a private moment that found its way out. It was a private moment that multiple sources, speaking to British and American outlets independently, described in near identical terms. Prince Harry, in the orbit of the Sydney appearances that Meghan Markle made in late March and early April 2026, was described by those familiar with the situation as visibly, unmistakably unsettled. The specific phrase that began circulating in royal press circles, sourced to someone described as close to the Sussex household, was this: that Harry had privately referred to the dynamic between Meghan and her longtime confidant Markus Anderson as a weird throuple. That word. That specific word. Coming from a man who has spent the better part of 3 years building a public image around emotional intelligence, therapy culture, and progressive partnership. That is the story. Not because of what the word reveals about Markus Anderson, not because of what it reveals about the Australia trip itself, but because of what it reveals about the pressure fractures forming inside a marriage that has been, for better or worse, the central narrative engine of one of the most consequential exits from royal life in modern British history. Let us be precise about what actually happened in Australia, because the tabloid version and the documented version are two different things, and the gap between them matters enormously here. Meghan Markle travelled to Australia in connection with a series of engagements tied to her expanding lifestyle and advocacy platform. The trip was framed publicly as a combination of philanthropic visibility and commercial partnership building, consistent with the post-Netflix, post-Spotify strategy the Sussexes have been executing since their major media deals either concluded or contracted significantly. Harry was not consistently present throughout the full trip. That absence and its specific timing became the first data point that reporters began triangulating around. Markus Anderson was present. He has been present consistently across major Sussex public moments for years. He is a Canadian hospitality executive with deep ties to the Soho House network, and his relationship with Meghan predates her relationship with Harry. He was at the royal wedding. He has appeared alongside Meghan at events in New York, in California, and now in Sydney. The British press, particularly the tabloid infrastructure, has been circling this dynamic for years, always careful to frame it within the boundaries of what can be printed without triggering legal action. But the Australian leg of events gave them new material because in Sydney, the physical proximity, the coordinated scheduling, and the photographic record combined in a way that reignited a conversation that the Sussex communications team has never formally addressed. The first is the PR reality. The Sussex brand has been built deliberately and expensively on the idea of a unified, progressive, emotionally aware partnership. Every interview, every podcast episode, every public appearance has reinforced the image of Harry and Meghan as a team. A team that left the monarchy together, that faced the press together, that narrated their own story together. The weird thruples framing, even as an unverified private comment, does fundamental damage to that image, not because it implies anything scandalous about Markus Anderson, but because it implies that Harry and Meghan are not in fact a unified front. That behind the curated image there is tension. That Harry is experiencing something he has not been given the narrative language to manage. That is a brand problem of the first order. The second is the psychological dimension, and this one matters to the international audience that has followed Harry specifically. Harry has spoken, at length and on the record, about his experiences with jealousy, insecurity, and the emotional damage inflicted by the royal institution. He has positioned himself as someone who has done the work. Therapy, ayahuasca, memoir, the whole apparatus of public vulnerability as credibility building. For a man who has staked that much of his public identity on emotional growth, the private snap, the unguarded use of a phrase like "none a weird thruple," lands differently than it would for any other public figure. It reads to his critics as evidence that the growth was more performed than real. It reads to his supporters as evidence that even the most emotionally aware person has limits. Either reading creates a problem. The third dimension is strategic, and this is the one that the royal press establishment is paying closest attention to. Australia was not a neutral choice of location for these engagements. The Australian public has historically had a complicated relationship with the monarchy, a fact that reached a kind of culmination with the ongoing conversation about whether Australia should fully sever its constitutional ties to the Crown. Meghan's presence there, without a consistent Harry, and with Markus Anderson as a visible companion in social and professional settings, created an optic that the British tabloid press was never going to leave alone. The Daily Mail, The Sun, The Express. These outlets have been documenting the Markus Anderson proximity for years, and the Australia trip gave them a geographical stage and a photographic record that renewed the story with fresh energy. Here is what the palace has not done, and this absence is meaningful. There has been no official comment from Buckingham Palace on any of this. King Charles's communications office does not engage with Sussex-adjacent stories as a rule, and that policy has been consistent since 2022. But sources within the royal household, speaking in the careful, deniable way that royal insiders have perfected over generations, have indicated that the palace is watching the Australia situation with what one correspondent described as quiet interest. That phrase, in royal press terms, is almost never neutral. It means something is being monitored. It means someone in that building sees an opportunity or a vulnerability and is deciding how to respond to it. The Sussex communications operation, for its part, did what it has done with most uncomfortable stories in recent months. Silence as a first response, then a carefully placed counter-narrative, not directly addressing the specific claim, but reinforcing the broader brand image. A social media post emphasizing partnership. A photograph of Harry and Meghan together, timed with enough precision to function as a rebuttal without requiring an actual statement. This is a communications strategy that has worked before. It worked to varying degrees during the succession of crises that followed the publication of The One Spare. It worked during the Netflix series Controversy. But royal correspondents who have covered this family for decades say that the Markus Anderson story is different in its staying power, precisely because it is not a single incident. It is a pattern. And patterns, in journalism and in public perception, are much harder to rebut with a single well-timed photograph. Let us talk specifically about Markus Anderson's role in the Sussex world, because the press coverage has frequently been long on implication and short on documented specifics. And that gap is where misinformation enters. Anderson is not a peripheral figure. He has been described by multiple outlets as one of Meghan's closest and most trusted friends, part of an inner circle that also includes Jessica Mulroney, though that relationship became publicly complicated in 2020. His professional background in hospitality and exclusive membership clubs gave Meghan access to a network of high-net-worth individuals and entertainment industry figures that proved strategically useful during the post-royal transition period. He attended the royal wedding in 2018. He has been photographed at multiple private and semi-public events with Meghan. His name appears in coverage of the early California period after the Sussexes relocated. What has never been established by any credible outlet with sourced reporting is anything beyond a close friendship. The tabloid implication has always been heavier than the tabloid evidence. But in the economy of royal gossip, implication does not need evidence to function. It needs repetition. And the Australia trip provided a new occasion for that repetition. The specific irritant, according to sources quoted in British outlets, was not any single moment but an accumulation, events attended, scheduling decisions that placed Anderson in proximity during moments when Harry was not present. The photographic record, which is inherently selective and inherently interpretable, became the substrate for a narrative that grew faster than the Sussex team could manage. Harry's reported private reaction, the weird thruple comment, needs to be understood in this context. If the sourcing is accurate and multiple outlets have now cited it independently without it being formally denied, then what it describes is not a man making a calculated public statement. It describes a man venting privately about a dynamic that is making him uncomfortable, using language that is casual, slightly contemptuous, and emotionally unguarded. That is a human response. It is also, given everything that has been constructed around the Sussex public narrative, a significant problem. The word thruple is culturally specific. It carries connotations that go beyond a simple expression of jealousy. It implies a triangulated emotional or romantic dynamic. Using it, even privately, even sarcastically, means that Harry is framing the Meghan Anderson relationship through a lens that he would never, under any circumstances, use in a public forum. The gap between his public language and his private language, as revealed by this reported comment, is exactly the kind of gap that undermines the credibility of the broader emotional narrative he has spent years constructing. His critics in Britain, and there are many, have seized on this with speed. The argument, now appearing in columns and commentary programs across the UK, is essentially this. Here is a man who wrote an entire memoir about emotional authenticity, who sat across from Oprah Winfrey and described his inner life in meticulous detail, who has become a kind of celebrity spokesperson for the therapeutic approach to personal conflict. And behind closed doors, he is describing his wife's friendship using the language of tabloid innuendo. The irony is almost too clean for his critics to ignore, and they have not. His supporters have a different reading, and it is worth presenting fairly. Their argument is that private frustration and public positioning are different things, that every person in every marriage has moments of unguarded emotion, and that using this specific moment to condemn Harry's broader character or his marriage is exactly the kind of reductive press behaviour that drove the Sussexes out of Britain in the first place. There is something to this. A private comment reported second-hand is not a press conference. It is not a formal statement of belief. It is a moment of human imperfection in a situation of sustained public pressure. But the problem with that defence is that Harry himself destroyed it. He is the one who built a public identity around the idea that his private self and his public self are the same. He is the one who published the memoir. He is the one who sat for the documentary. He traded on the idea that what you see is what you get, that the emotional transparency is real and not performed. Once you make that trade, you cannot then retreat behind the privacy argument when your private language surfaces and contradicts your public image. The rules changed when he changed them. What this story ultimately reveals is something that has been true for several years now, but has rarely been stated with this much clarity in the mainstream press. The Sussex operation, for all its ambition and all its innovation in terms of how royal adjacent figures can build independent commercial and cultural platforms, remains extraordinarily vulnerable to exactly the kind of tabloid narrative pressure that it was designed to escape. The move to California, the Netflix deal, the memoir, the Oprah interview, the podcast, the brand launches, none of it has created sufficient insulation from the British press ecosystem that Harry and Meghan defined themselves against. And the reason for that is structural. The British tabloid press does not need physical proximity to generate a story about the Sussexes. It needs sources, timing, and a narrative hook. The Australia trip provided all three. Markus Anderson's presence provided the hook. Harry's reported private comment provided the emotional core. And the gap between the Sussex public image and the Sussex private reality provided the engine. That engine is not running out of fuel. If anything, the Australia episode suggests it has been refueled. The Markus Anderson story is not new. What is new is that it now has a direct quote attached to it, sourced to Harry himself, that transforms it from tabloid implication into something that functions in the press ecosystem as near confession. Not a confession of anything inappropriate, a confession of vulnerability. A confession that the architecture of emotional security that Harry has spent years describing and defending is not as solid as the public presentation has suggested. That is the real story out of Australia, not a scandal in the tabloid sense. A fracture in a carefully maintained image, surfacing in an unguarded moment in a country on the other side of the world, with the British press watching every frame of footage and reading every sourced quote with the kind of sustained attention that has followed this family for decades and shows absolutely no sign of stopping. The question is not what Markus Anderson's role in this story is. The question is what Harry does now with a story he cannot legally challenge, cannot credibly deny without amplifying, and cannot simply wait out because it has attached itself to a pattern that has been documented across years and continents, and is now, as of April 2026, running with fresh momentum in a direction that neither he nor his communications team appears to have been fully prepared for. That is where this stands, and that is why, in the rooms where royal strategy is discussed, on both sides of the Sussex divide, the phone calls happening right now are not short ones.